and you'll probably be asked if that's okay. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. There may be some other people who come on. This is the first in our diversity lecture series hosted by the Department of Educational Studies Diversity and Inclusion Committee. The title of the presentation today is Understanding the Antecedents and Benefits of STEM Career and Technical Education Course Taking for High School Students with Learning Disabilities. Our presenters are Jay Plasman from OSU, Michael Gottfried and Jennifer Freeman from the University of Pennsylvania, and Shaun Dougherty from Vanderbilt University. What we'll do is have the presentation at the beginning and leave a few minutes at the end for questions. So with that, I will turn it over to our presenters.
Jay, since you organized, I want to confirm I am first, right? Okay, good. Well, thank you for having us on Friday afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I was hoping when Jay talked about a panel like this on CTE back, maybe it was when you first got to OSU, that it would be in person. I really wanted to visit. So I hope this does not preclude us from coming again at some point in the future when we could all hang out in person. That would be really great. I've always wanted to actually see the campus and visit. So I am the antecedents of the presentation, thinking about course taking for students with learning disabilities. So my presentation is Who's Taking What? STEM CT course taking for high school students with learning disabilities. And it's a team effort, but I am the presenter of this team. So starting off with a little bit of policy background. So what we've heard, time and time again is that students with learning disabilities are quote unquote bad at math, right? Why am I so bad at math? What's going on with math, learning disabilities and math, right? I think a lot of times stereotypically we think about learning disabilities as being related to reading, but there is a lot of work thinking about learning disabilities and math. And so what do we know about learning disabilities in STEM is that students, when we do think about math, as well as other areas of STEM, is they face additional learning challenges. And as a result of that, we see that there are consequences across the STEM pipeline. So they tend to take fewer classes in STEM in high school. They also, once they get to college, are less likely to have a STEM major. And then they're also less likely to pick up a STEM career. And so for my presentation in the sequence that you'll be seeing today, I'm here at this first node of the pipeline, thinking about course taking and who is taking what, and are they taking fewer classes, particularly in STEM. So that's one piece of the policy challenge for us, is thinking about students with learning disabilities and STEM course taking. The second piece, of course, brings in this CTE, career and technical education. So over the past decade or so, we've seen a lot of talk about CTE and students with disabilities / special education. So we could see here that we have guidance from West Virginia schools as an example of CTE for students with disabilities. We have the Association for Career and Technical Education talking about CTE for students with disabilities. So again, a quick policy background is that over the past, as I said, few decades, there's been more and more of a push for funding to be expanded for CTE in high school. And specifically what's of interest to us is in 2006 and 2018, there were two key features of the Perkins Act reauthorizations at the federal level. So one, there was an increase in access, or a call for increase in access to CTE for students with disabilities. There was also a call to increase STEM offerings and rigor. So we are finding ourselves at this intersection in our project, thinking about CTE access and specifically in STEM CTE. So really quickly, this will help set all of our presentations up, is what is this STEM CTE that I keep mentioning? So within the CTE course offerings, there are two clusters which are called STEM CTE. One is engineering technology. You can think about this as drafting, other types of engineering courses. And one is information technology, which you could think about as being computer science. And then there are some STEM CTE adjacent areas. It's a little bit of a gray area, and that includes health and architecture. Some argue that health should be included. but there are some courses in health that may or may not be considered STEM. So those are STEM adjacent, STEM related, but for sure 2 of them, engineering and computer science, are considered STEM CTE, and we'll also quickly look at these other 2. So these STEM CTE courses are pretty unique in that they emphasize skill acquisition by focusing on real world STEM problems, right? So it's a departure from traditional ways of learning and teaching and thinking about theories and thinking about how these things can be applied to real world issues. I should also say that they range in ability level, right? So these are not necessarily quote unquote traditional vocational courses for students who are not college bound. There are STEM CTE courses that are for that purpose. There are others that are for students at the higher STEM ability level. So it ranges, much like traditional STEM courses range. There is some evidence across the pipeline for the general population that kids who do take these courses tend to drop out less, and they tend to take advanced STEM courses. So we see some evidence of educational attainment as well as specific pipeline STEM attainment. At the post-secondary level, kids who are taking STEM CTE courses in high school are more likely to major in STEM once they get to college as well. So more evidence that we see a carving out of the STEM pipeline when students are taking these STEM CTE courses starting in high school. So we think that there's some benefit for students with learning disabilities. And the reason we think that is because these courses are more hands-on and they're more activity-based. And we think this corresponds better with this type of learning that students with learning disabilities often need. And it aligns with recommended accommodations when it comes to IEPs, thinking about multiple senses, lab experiences. So again, a departure from just traditional abstract theories of math and science, as well as demonstrations by the instructor. So that sets up our study purpose, is that, again, there's more CTE being offered now than ever before. There's more of a focus on STEM CTE within that. And there's been more of a focus in getting students with disabilities in these courses. So this first paper starts at the beginning of that pipeline and asks, first off, are students with learning disabilities taking more CTE courses? And how does this compare to students without learning disabilities? And then we ask specifically, because we're interested in STEM, how do these patterns differ when we look specifically at the STEM CTE pipeline? So that's engineering and computer science. And then what about these STEM adjacent CTE courses? So this would be the health and architecture. So we really wanted to know who is taking what. With all of these courses out there, who is taking what? So to analyze these questions, we used the high school longitudinal study of 2009. So the students were in 9th grade in 2009. It's a nationally representative sample of the United States. And we have student variables linked to full transcripts, so we know exactly what the students took. And we also have some contextual information. We know about their families and we know about their schools. So in sum, we had 18,250 students, and we could see their transcripts throughout their entire high school career. 7% had a learning disability, which is pretty on par with prior research, as well as the rate in the national population. And then the other 93% did not have a disability. So in our study, we compared students with learning disabilities to those students who didn't have any type of disability. So just really quickly on the variables. So the outcomes we're interested in were course taking outcomes. So the first one was, did I take a CTE course? And then we also asked, how many units of CTE did I take? The second one was, did I take a STEM CTE course? And the number of units that I took. And then I took one of these STEM related CTE courses and the number of units that I took. And again, the benefit of this type of data set is that we have a ton of control variables that you wouldn't necessarily have if you were using a district or state data set. So we know a lot about the student, and that's pretty similar to a district or state data set, but then where it's really rich is in terms of the household. We know a lot about parents and socioeconomic status. We also have a lot of academic background, so not just GPA, but attitudes about school, expectations for how far I'll go in college, and so forth. And then if you'll indulge me in one nerdy slide with an equation. So the outcome for student I and school S is a function of, did I have a learning disability, as well as all of those control variables that I just mentioned. So in this baseline model, I wanted to look at why these course taking outcomes I wanted to see, does having a learning disability predict whether or not I take these courses with the controls? And then I accounted for the fact that students are clustered within schools. And then for the yellow bar below, one issue is that some schools offer different amounts of CTE than others. So it's not really fair to compare students in one school to students in another school where the offerings differ, right? So the best thing to do for this research question would be to just compare students within the same school. So to compare students with learning disabilities in one school to students without disabilities in that same school, and that's known as a school fixed effects model. So then briefly, I'm just going to show you the coefficients for learning disability. So here I'm predicting learning disability on whether I took CTE and how many units of CTE I took. All the other variables are in the model. So we have lots of control variables, but for the sake of time, I just wanted to show you this. So what we see here is we see a positive coefficient on most of our models, including our preferred model of school fixed effects. And so what this means is that students with learning disabilities are taking more CTE courses compared to students without disabilities. So they're 3% more likely to take anything, so that's the 0.03. And they have about 0.3 more units earned. And this holds true in our most robust model in this study, where we have the school fixed effects. So what we find when we look at that first research question on general CTE course taking is, yes, students with learning disabilities are taking more of those kinds of courses than students without disabilities. So then we go to research question 2 and 3, which I put on the same slide, because as you can see, we don't have any stars. We actually have null findings. And the same is true for research question 3, where we look at health and architecture. So in other words, students with learning disabilities are not taking STEM CTE courses any differently than students without disabilities. So we don't necessarily think of this as a negative, right? If we had had a negative coefficient with stars, we would start seeing a gap that students with disabilities were taking these courses less than students without. But what we see here is that the course taking patterns are actually similar between students with learning disabilities and students without disabilities. So to keep myself on track on time, just a few quick discussion points is that, again, we don't really see evidence of a students with learning disabilities STEM course taking gap in key CTE areas like CTE. And so Perkins has this focus on increasing access and participation for students with learning disabilities. And so the null results, we think they're slightly positive, although when we get to discussion, I'd love to hear everyone's interpretation. Is this a positive or negative? Would we have preferred to see a positive coefficient? In other words, do we want students with learning disabilities to have taken more compared to the other students? They're not taking less, but they're also not taking more. The other thing that's interesting, of course, is research question 1, is that we see that students with learning disabilities are taking more CTE courses in general compared to those without disabilities. So is there some sort of stratification, right? Is there sorting? If they're not taking any differences in terms of STEM, where are they taking these courses? And then finally, there's a question for policymakers. So when Perkins asked for more participation for students from all types of underrepresented groups, first of all, what kind of supports are in place for that? And then the second question is, how do we know when we've reached those goals as policymakers? Have goals been set? Where would they have liked these coefficients to be? So we don't have really a call for that. So we don't really have benchmarks to gauge when could we say Perkins has been successful. And so we call for policymakers to give us more guidance as to when they think that we have been successful in getting more students from diverse backgrounds into these areas. So thank you for having me, and I will pass the torch.
All right, I believe I am up next. So let me just share my screen here. Okay. So this project really builds off of what we've been doing with Michael's stuff. This one is entitled Promoting Persistence: Can Computer Science Career and Technical Education Courses Support Educational Advancement for Students with Learning Disabilities? So in the world of work, there's kind of this idea that we need more high-skilled workers. And particularly, we need those high skilled workers in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics areas. And they're extremely fast growing. And when you think about STEM in general, it becomes more and more necessary that you have this kind of computer science knowledge. And computer science fields themselves are expected to grow particularly rapidly. But even if you're not necessarily in a computer science field, you're going to need some computer science skills. Unfortunately, the supply in computer science doesn't necessarily match the demand. So basically, we're not getting as many students through with computer science degrees or with computer science knowledge as the job market is requiring. So we need more computer science people. Now let's talk about the students with learning disabilities in STEM. So this kind of follows up a lot with what Michael was talking about. So we know that students with learning disabilities are underrepresented along the STEM pipeline. In high school, this means that they're taking fewer STEM courses, also means that they're taking fewer computer science courses. And when they get to college, they're less likely to major in computer science. So we find that this kind of underrepresentation is not just at one level, but it's kind of from the very beginning. It's all along. This falls into career. Students with learning disabilities are underrepresented once they get into career computer science as careers. Now, as Michael was talking about, CTE may be a way to help promote this and encourage students with learning disabilities to participate in computer science. Though we didn't necessarily find that they're taking more, it may be that in some way it's helping these students with learning disabilities to kind of enhance their possibilities. So when we're thinking about the pipeline along STEM from high school to college to career, there are these three key attitudes that kind of relate to whether or not we'd expect students to succeed and to persist along those pipelines. The first is STEM identity, which is essentially, do I view myself as a member of the STEM community, and do others view me as a member of the STEM community? This ultimately, people who have higher STEM identity are more likely to engage and participate in STEM more fully and for longer periods of time. And you can develop some of this STEM identity through hands-on and relevant experiences, which may sound similar to some things that CTE does. So STEM self-efficacy is the belief in your ability to succeed in a given task, in this case specifically related to STEM. Having a higher STEM self-efficacy, so having stronger beliefs that you can succeed, is related to higher achievement, higher persistence, better skill growth. And this can be developed through the mastery observation of skills and through social persuasion. So having peers that succeed, having a role model that pushes you. And in this area, building confidence in STEM is really one of the keys. And finally, this idea of STEM utility. It's the willingness to complete an undertaking because of its perceived future usefulness. So do I think that that taking STEM will benefit me some way in the future with relation to my job or something like that? This ultimately influences the courses that I choose to take in high school and what I choose to major in college. And this is developed also through real world application. So again, something that relates to the design of CTE. So let's kind of look at how all these things link together. So computer science CTE, it falls into what Michael was talking about in that it's one area of the applied STEM CTE. So I'm not going to go too much into exactly what it is. But let's talk about how that relates to STEM attitudes and students with learning disabilities. So first of all, CTE in general and computer science by relation is relevant and rigorous, and it employs a lot of hands-on learning, applicable experiences. Students with learning disabilities often excel through instruction through using the use of multiple senses. So, touching, feeling, hearing, and this is aligns a lot with the way that career and technical education is kind of delivered. Additionally, many accommodations, as Michael mentioned, for students with learning disabilities align with instructional techniques in CTE courses. And further, in a lot of CTE courses, students kind of receive more personalized instruction that would be aligned with individualized education plans that they may receive in school. And this is regardless of whether a student has an IEP on paper or not. So this kind of alignment with personalizing instruction is really a kind of built into CTE. So what did we do in this study? So we asked three kind of big questions. First of all, kind of building off what Michael talked about in his study, what are the characteristics of students who participate in computer science CTE in high school? Does participation in this CS-CTE tie to development of these positive STEM attitudes, including identity, self-efficacy, and utility? And is there a differential relationship for students with learning disabilities? So again, we use the same data set, the high school longitudinal study of 2009, so I won't go into detail about that as it's already been covered. We had similar control variables, but our outcomes in this case were CS-CTE participation, yes or no, as well as the variables of STEM identity, STEM self-efficacy, and STEM utility. And these were all defined in the data set. So we didn't create these. We used ones that were already existing. We included the socio-demographic variables as controls, the academic history and attitude variables, and we also included some school level variables, such as was it a public school or private school, urban or rural areas, and some school level demographics like percent English language learner, percent receiving free or reduced lunch, and so on. So again, no need to look at the equation, but what we did for our first one was what were my odds of participating in CTE, and what were the predictors of those, the student characteristics and the school characteristics. And then for our research questions 2 and 3, we did kind of two things. We did a very basic regression model where our attitude of interest, so whether it was utility, self-efficacy, or identity, that was our outcome. And we also controlled for the baseline model, or the baseline level of that. So we had a measure at freshman year and then another measure at junior year. And so we were able to account for where they started. And then there's an issue when looking at trying to evaluate career and technical education, in that students who participate in it may actually be different than students who do not participate in it. So we used a propensity score matching technique. So essentially matched on 2 levels: the likelihood of having a learning disability. So there may be some students who aren't diagnosed with learning disabilities, but may have a lot of the characteristics that would benefit if they did receive the resources associated with being identified as such. And there are also different motivations for students who decide to participate in career technical education. So what did we find? One important note was that learning disability status was not actually a predictor of whether or not a student participated in career and technical education in the computer science area, which is very similar to what Michael found. In fact, for students with learning disabilities, the only significant predictor was whether or not they came from a single parent household, in which case they were less likely to participate. For students who were did not have disabilities, females were less likely to participate. A higher math score was associated with less likelihood of participation. More academic credits was associated with a higher likelihood. And if they were in a public high school, they are actually less likely to participate. So that was kind of the big findings that we had from research question 1. With respect to our STEM attitudes, so under our first model, our OLS model, we found that for the general student population and for students without learning disabilities or without disabilities, they were more likely to have developed more STEM identity. Same with STEM self-efficacy. And for STEM utility, it was actually the students with learning disabilities who experienced kind of a bump. So kind of switched. Then we looked at our propensity score matching techniques, and the patterns generally held the same. Again, we found students with learning disabilities were not more likely to, significantly more likely to develop STEM identity, while students without learning disabilities were. Same with STEM self-efficacy, though in this case, when we matched, we found that students with learning disabilities did actually experience a bump in their STEM self-efficacy. And the same held with STEM utility. So overall, the big change was in STEM self-efficacy. So we're finding that maybe this propensity score matching technique was allowing us to kind of account for some of those potential biases. So basically, yeah, we found that it's good. So this kind of overall, this aligns with Dr. Gottfried's presentation, no gap in career science or computer science, career and technical education. Self-efficacy is bumped up for both groups when we use matching. Utility is actually the only bumped up for students with learning disabilities, and identity is really only bumped up for students without learning disabilities. So what are some of the implications? So interestingly, this computer science coursework appears to help STEM attitudes differently for different populations. So there might be different mechanisms that work for students with learning disabilities as opposed to students without disabilities. For students with learning disabilities, if this isn't a way to increase their STEM identity, what would work? So that's kind of a future consideration. Further, self-efficacy and utility are important to develop along the STEM pipeline. How do we continue to expand participation for this group of students, students with learning disabilities? And what are the specific aspects of computer science CTE that are beneficial for students with learning disabilities, and how do we kind of continue to enhance that? So with that, I believe we are on to Jen.
Hi, everyone. All right, let me share my screen. All right, so I am going to be talking to you about kind of the third paper in this series of papers, where I'm really exploring the post-secondary outcomes related to participation in these applied STEM courses in high school. And the title of this paper is "Can STEM-Focused Career Courses Strengthen the Secondary to Post-Secondary Pipeline for Students with Learning Disabilities?" So just as a little bit of background, which my colleagues have covered quite nicely, students with learning disabilities are historically represented throughout the STEM pipeline. And this is troubling because these students are highly capable of succeeding in these STEM content areas as long as they are provided accommodations and appropriate coursework. So as Michael mentioned, and Jay, these students are not taking high school STEM courses at the same rates as students in the general student population, which means that they are also less likely to pursue STEM degrees in college. So the Perkins Act in 2018 and 2016 really called to increase access to CTE for students in special populations, specifically being students with disabilities, and also called to increase STEM offerings in high school. So with that in mind, just as a quick refresher, even though I know we just heard both of my colleagues present, I'm referring to these STEM CTE courses in this presentation as applied STEM courses or ASCTE courses, because I'm going to be differentiating the difference between other traditional STEM majors and applied STEM majors. And these courses fall into the two categories of engineering technology and information technology, which really map onto the post-secondary degrees as engineering and computer science majors. So we have three proposed mechanisms, which we think might describe the link between applied STEM course taking and college major selection in STEM fields for students with learning disabilities. The first of which is academic reinforcement. So students with learning disabilities often struggle in traditional STEM courses just because of the memorization and text-based instruction strategies of the curriculum. And these applied STEM courses really provide an additional and new learning opportunity that students can reinforce what they learned in previous traditional STEM courses, but in a more applicable way that's more accessible to their individual learning styles. And so these courses might offer a better way for students with learning disabilities to really solidify the STEM content and make that they learned in traditional courses and make them more college ready to study STEM fields. Second of these mechanisms is relevance and engagement. So applied STEM courses, as my colleagues mentioned, create a very direct connection to real world problems that students may experience in college and career in STEM fields. And they are also fit to the unique learning styles of students with learning disabilities. So by taking these courses, these students may create a better perspective of just how relevant this applied STEM material could be to college and to career. Also, engagement, participation in these courses and CTE courses in general has been linked to increased high school engagement, whether that be through being less likely to drop out, more likely to take more advanced STEM courses in high school. So at the very least, students who participate in these courses may be more likely or incentivized to just stay in school, which has been shown to make them more likely to attend college. And finally is skill formation. So these classes, the big buzzwords, activity-based, hands-on, these courses really promote development of skills, specifically in STEM skills in these applied STEM subjects that students can use in college and in career. And so when students know that there's a direct relevance of the skills they're learning, this definitely leads to the utility that Jay was just talking about previously. They might be more likely to consider majoring in a specific applied STEM major in college. So with that in mind, this current study, like I discussed, previous work has really explored benefits of applied STEM course taking for students with learning disabilities, but that's been primarily focused in high school. And so no work has specifically looked at college STEM outcomes. And secondly, there is evidence that these courses do help students remain in the STEM pipeline in high school. But we're really unclear if these students are continuing through the STEM pipeline once they actually get to college, or if they're kind of dropping off. So with that in mind, the research questions we are asking in this paper are whether applied STEM course taking in high school is linked to college enrollment for students with learning disabilities. And also if applied STEM course taking is related to students seriously considering and ultimately declaring a STEM major in college. So to let you all know, for research question 2, we were interested in looking at 2 different categories of STEM majors. First were applied STEM majors, which you'll see for the rest of the presentation referred to as AS majors. And these are majors that are related directly to applied STEM courses in high school, which are your engineering and your computer science courses. And then we refer to all the other STEM majors as non-AS STEM majors. So this is going to be your traditional STEM courses, your biology, physics, math, all of that. So just wanted to throw that up before you see a bunch of acronyms come in your way. So for our data, once again, we used the high school longitudinal study of 2009. Specifically for this analysis, we used the data that was collected in the baseline year in 9th grade, the 2013 transcript update, and the first follow-up, which occurred 3 years after the students graduated from high school. Secondly, we limited our sample to only include students with learning disabilities. And this was based on parent surveys in the baseline year as to whether their student had been diagnosed with a learning disability. And our sample was about 950 students. So the variables in our analysis, we had 3 outcomes. First was college enrollment. Second is whether the students answered that they had most seriously considered a specific major upon entering post-secondary education. And we broke this into AS and non-AS STEM majors, and also whether they ultimately declared one of these majors in college. Control variables, we had a very rich set of control variables, very similar to what Michael and Jay both used in their analysis. So here's the analysis plan. I won't go into the actual mechanics of every single one of the variables, but as you can see here, we have our baseline model. But we also recognize, just as Jay did, that students who participate and students who choose to enroll in applied STEM courses may be inherently different than students who do not enroll, whether it be due to motivations or other observable characteristics. So I also employed the use of propensity score matching to match students on the likelihood of having taken these courses in high school as a way to better estimate the impact of participation in these courses and also to reduce the bias in our baseline model. So for our first research question, I'm only showing our key our outcome here, but all of our controls were used in this analysis. First, we see that there's no significant kind of null findings here for college enrollment. So similar to some of the findings Michael found, it just looks like for students with learning disabilities who did take applied STEM courses, they had relatively similar rates of college enrollment than students with learning disabilities who did not take these courses. For the second research question, as you can see, this is as students with learning disabilities earned more credits in applied STEM courses in high school. They were 7% more likely to seriously consider an applied STEM major. So once again, these are your engineering and your computer science majors. When taking in consideration the other types of non-AS STEM majors, there was no significant findings there. So they were no more or less likely to seriously consider a biology, a physics, a math major. Second, the second part of research question 2, this is actual declaration of a major. So we found that, as you can see, as students with learning disabilities earned more units in applied STEM courses, they were 6 percentage points more likely to actually declare an applied STEM major. And here for the non-applied STEM majors, you could see that we actually found some significant results, and that students with learning disabilities who took more of these courses were actually less likely to declare a non-AS STEM major. So to show you the results of our propensity score matching as an added test of robustness, as you can see, there's 2 things I want to point out here. First is when you look across the OLS to the PSM columns, you can see that there's a good amount of consistency in the significance of the findings for serious consideration of majors, college enrollment, and declaration of majors. However, one thing to point out is that the significance of declaration of a non-AS major fell off. So this kind of leads us to believe that the more robust comparison group through the use of propensity score matching gave us a more precise estimate of what was of the effect of taking applied STEM courses on declaring a non-AS major. So this just means that our OLS model might have been overestimating the negative effect on this specific outcome. Let's see here. So just to wrap things up, to stay on time, applied STEM courses did not link to college enrollment for students with learning disabilities. This is not a negative finding because these courses were made to motivate students within STEM to continue to take more STEM courses and potentially declare majors in college. So one good thing is that college enrollment is not being hampered by taking these courses. Second, results show evidence of a applied STEM secondary to post-secondary pipeline. So students who earned more applied STEM credits in high school were more likely to seriously consider and declare an AS major. And so this is evidence that students who take more AS courses are persisting in applied STEM fields after high school and into college. And hopefully one day we can figure out if that's continuing into career. Finally, from our results, no evidence that applied STEM course taking predicts any link to non-applied STEM majors, but once again, this is not necessarily a negative finding because these courses are really designed to engage students in applied STEM material. and to continue to explore these specific applied STEM majors in college. So the results of this study are very promising. A lot of prior studies focus on the deficits of students with learning disabilities. And our findings suggest that there's a really positive potential for an applied STEM pipeline for these students that can help them persist in college and potentially beyond. So my colleagues touched a little bit on the policy implications, but policymakers and school districts might try to consider how to increase participation of students with learning disabilities in these applied STEM courses in order to really bolster the positive effects in college and career. Thank you. I am going to throw over to Shaun.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks. Well, hang on one second. I'm gonna try and share my screen. And can y'all hear me? Okay. All right. One second. I can at least see the gallery. All right. Well, thank you very much for including me in this panel, to Jay for helping to organize, and to the Ohio State University for facilitating. I'm pleased to get to talk, albeit a bit quickly. I apologize. I've got a hard stop at 5 minutes of the hour to present next hour at the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management, and some kiddos to check in on in the 5-minute interval in between. So without further ado, you can see my slides on the second screen. Is that right? Okay, I'll just jump in. This is a combination of papers that I'll share here. Anyway, there's joint work with my colleague Isabel Harbaugh McDonald at Harvard University, and then my PhD student and co-author Walter Ecton at Vanderbilt. And so I'll present a little bit from both of these papers across this presentation. So I'll just jump right into it. So with respect to students with disabilities and STEM CTE, this is first just an overall, these are overall trends in STEM CTE enrollment in Massachusetts over a decade. You'll notice the end date is not quite up to date, but these trends sort of, if I had the more up-to-date figure to show you, would sort of continue along these lines. So on the left-hand axis, we have that pertain to the solid lines, total student enrollment in STEM CTE and non-STEM CTE over time, and you can see that they're both going up. STEM CTE is a smaller share in Massachusetts than overall, but you can also see the dashed blue line, and the right-hand axis shows you that the percent is increasing over time, in addition to the absolute levels of STEM CTE. And so as this is happening, the question will sort of naturally arise, does this extend to individuals with disabilities as well? And so this is just another table from that same paper, but if I can draw your attention to the bottom line here, which is for students who have an identified disability, you can see in Massachusetts overall, there are more individuals with disabilities identified than the national average, so 16.5%. That students with disabilities are overrepresented in STEM, in CTE generally, this elevated number here, but sort of less than proportionally or around proportionally. These are not necessarily statistically significant. These are just the averages. A little less likely to participate in STEM CTE, certainly than CTE overall, and a little less than the prevalence in the population. If we look a decade later, there in this sample, a larger share of students who are being identified as having a disability, a little smaller share in CTE overall, and about the same share in STEM CTE. So in this paper, we were really looking at does the composition change over time of who's participating in what, and sort of the answer here in Massachusetts was students with disabilities are heavily invested in CTE and about proportionally invested in STEM CTE, but less than in other non-STEM fields. So we dug in a little further here, and within STEM CTE, we broke it out into sort of 3 buckets. The buckets that we are able to break things into in Massachusetts are a little bit different than what we can do with the nationally representative data that other folks in this panel have used, and provide some really nice, more detailed information. Here we can look at clusters for manufacturing, technology and engineering, health services, and information technology. And again, if we focus on the bottom line here, we can see that over time there's been an increase in participation in STEM CTE as pertains to manufacturing, technology and engineering for students with disabilities. But over that same decade period, we saw a reduction in participation or a lower share in more recent cohorts in health services CTE, but quite a large positive difference in IT. And so as STEM CTE has been increasing across time, and as individuals with disabilities are participating at elevated rates, we see just some heterogeneity. We don't have a whole lot to say in this paper about whether these changes in the sort of relative investments in these different dimensions of CTE were sort of better or worse than the previous, in part because the student composition and policy context is a bit different. But just to note that there are these sort of shifts in the composition of who's participating in what, and that in particular for individuals with disabilities, that there's been a shift towards IT, which has been one of the fastest growing dimensions of STEM, applied STEM CTE in Massachusetts over this time period. Also in manufacturing, technology and engineering, which has also been growing, but this sort of lower investment in health services CTE, which we haven't yet unpacked. I should have said probably 2 minutes ago, but I'll say now just that thinking about individuals with disabilities, I know the focus is on students with learning disabilities for this panel, and just note that if I show you the sort of tabulation of disability categories within CTE, the overwhelming majority in Massachusetts of individuals with disabilities that are participating in CTE are individuals with learning disabilities. So it's not like 100% alignment with this sort of high level focus that I'm doing, but almost 100%, 85 plus in terms of the share of students with disabilities in CTE in Massachusetts. Oops. Okay, so then next, one of the questions that we asked ourselves was, what accounts for these differences? Could it be that some of the factors that might relate to individuals being identified as having a learning disability or having a disability could that be related to them being less likely to select into STEM CTE? And so what we looked at are across 2 time periods. So this is no longer 2004 and 2014, in part because the earlier years we didn't have the same set of test score data available for everyone. But basically you can think of the first 2 columns here include controls for prior test scores, so 8th grade test scores. And the latter two columns don't. And these are regression models that include all of these other controls as well. But if you look in the last 2 columns inside the green box, it looks like individuals with disabilities were less likely to participate in STEM, applied STEM CTE, to the tune of like 5 to 7 percentage points less likely if we don't control for prior 8th grade test score. But that once we do that, though the difference is still statistically significant, it's more like 1 to 2 percentage points different. And all this to say that some of the differences we observe in the patterns of participation might be linked to prior test score performance, which I'm going to remain value neutral on this because we're in sort of a black box environment and we haven't done a closer look to understand the dynamics here. This could be if prior math performance is important for success in applied STEM, maybe this is a good screening mechanism. On the other hand, this could be evidence that prior test scores are being used to screen out students with disabilities from participating at higher levels in applied STEM or certain dimensions of applied STEM. And so this is something that deserves a closer look to make sure that there is equitable access to all dimensions of CTE, period, but in particular with respect to applied STEM when we think about the Massachusetts context and access for individuals with disabilities. So recognizing my own hard stop, as well as sort of hewing to norms around time distribution, I'm going to jump ahead and get to the so what here. So in this other paper with Walt Ecton and myself, we looked at returns to investing in 2 or more years of CTE in high school. And this gets away a little bit from the applied STEM for the moment, but across different student groups, we look, and the purple dot here, I've got red arrows pointing in the 2 columns. The purple dot corresponds to students with disabilities who participate in 2 or more years of CTE. We find overall are more likely to go to college, overall are a little less likely to earn a college degree, but there is this really large sort of positive effect, 5 percentage points more likely to go to a 2-year college and 1 percentage point more likely to finish a 2-year degree. And then for 4-year college, it's students with disabilities who are in 2 or more years of CTE were less likely to go to a 4-year college, less likely to attain a 4-year degree. But if we compare that to the literal, not metaphorical black box here, as the first estimate is for overall, students with disabilities are outperforming sort of the average when it goes to college going, and college completion is the upshot here. Which when we think about the role of CTE in promoting longer term outcomes, I think this is a pretty powerful conclusion. Perhaps more importantly, or just as importantly, here we have the payoff in terms of earnings at 1, 3, 5, and 7 years after high school completion. Upper left is the overall, and you can see these are all positive figures in between $2,500 and $3,500 additional dollars per year. These are, you can think about this as, we've got it for across a range of student groups, but I'll just focus your attention down here and towards the lower right. For students with disabilities, they're sort of right at the average in 1 year after high school, but well above the average, and maintaining it in ways that students without disabilities are not. And so there's like pretty substantial earnings premia in that, the better part of a decade after completing high school that we think are quite consequential. And in fact, we're getting into breaking this down now in terms of heterogeneity, depending on what field someone is employed in, what industry. So there's a lot more to do, but we think this is suggestively positive evidence of the potential medium-term positive impacts of these investments in CTE, and perhaps really further highlights the importance of making sure there's equitable access to applied STEM, the high return fields, in terms of promoting better long-term outcomes. So I will end there and just say thank you again for including me.
Thanks to all of you for your great presentations. We have a few minutes to open the floor for questions from our audience, so feel free to turn on your mics or put something in chat for our presenters, please.
Well, I have a question for Jennifer about the going to college piece. Was there any effort to break it out between 2-year and 4-year colleges in that analysis that you did?
Yes, so we did. The one downside of using the data set that we did use is that since the first update was only 3 years after the supposed graduation from high school, we didn't have a full picture of transfer patterns or of how many different post-secondary institutions they went to. It was kind of a little bit messy. So that's why we decided to just limit it to all post-secondary education. And also that's kind of next steps. So stay tuned. I should add to that also, the newest update from HSLS actually came out about a month ago that has full post-secondary transcripts up until the end of 2016. So that's going to allow us to shed a lot more light on that exact question.
I have another one if I can. I'm a bit confused by STEM CTE and non-STEM CTE. And then in the first presentation, there was a focus on engineering and information tech, as it sounded like the only STEM CTE programs. So I'm just confused because personally, I think all CTE is STEM. So I'm trying to figure out, how these were delineated as being worthy or not. So that's what I'm confused about.
We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Okay, this headphone. So for sure, engineering, technology, and computer science are undoubtedly part of the STEM CTE profile. The issue comes with the categories of the other ones. So definitely there are courses within health, for example, that would be considered CTE, but on the, or would be considered STEM. But on the aggregate, some of the courses in there couldn't be considered STEM just by the way they're developed. And same for the architecture category. There are some in there that wouldn't necessarily be considered STEM. So it's challenging and it's difficult. It's conversations we've actually had with IES as well, as what do you do with a category like health sciences that sounds like it should be STEM, but then some of the courses in there might not be STEM. And Jen, I might validate this to you. Do you remember some of the examples, or Jay, do you remember some of the examples of things in health or architecture that wouldn't necessarily be STEM? Do you remember any of the course titles?
Yeah, so some of the health courses would be how to, like there was some about how, like receptionist, like how to organize medical files based like as like a receptionist at a health office. So you're learning, you're using computers, but it's not necessarily applying any traditional STEM concepts in a more like relevant real world way. It's just learning how to organize and go through. And additionally, another example of health would be how to fill out insurance paperwork for patients. So those are some examples, and there's examples across all of them. There's actually this great spreadsheet that goes through all of the SCED codes and all of the listings for the different CTE courses. And there's a lot of overlap, and there's some health and some architecture, like Michael said, are not STEM, some that are. So in order to kind of generalize it, that's why we decided to include those as STEM related, but not necessarily STEM. And also to your first point, I noticed that there wasn't across all the presentations, but the way that Michael characterized STEM courses, that was the same characterization that I used when I used the word applied STEM. So his STEM CTE were the same type of courses as my AS CTE, but since I wanted to include the classification of other types of post-secondary STEM majors, that's why I made that further delineation from the term that Michael used, just so it would be less confusing, which now I'm realizing a lot of acronyms can get confusing, but that's kind of CTE.
So if I may, then information technology could say include a course in programming, which I would agree would be STEM. But what about a course on how to get an Adobe certification? Is that STEM? I'm just playing devil's advocate. That to me is almost the same as that medical filing example that you gave.
That is a good question. Jay, I feel like you were about to answer. You might have to.
So I would say getting the Adobe certificate is still technology based. you know, it provides some of those technology skills, whereas possibly like a, you know, computer, like a filing is not really employing the same kind of skill set. So it really, I think, has to do with kind of that. And so we're not necessarily the ones, like we've looked at these and we weren't necessarily the ones who were like, this is STEM, this isn't STEM. It's kind of aligned with what has been done previously. Like it's kind of identified by the national, by IES. They have gone and identified some of this, and we also have aligned it with some of the NSF definitions of STEM. So under both of those, they talk about health as adjacent for exactly the reasons that Michael did. But then if you look at things like, you know, if you even go beyond that into like business, then you get like, you know, some of the like business receptionist type stuff is clearly would not be STEM. And you get some of the, you know, like if you go into culinary arts or whatever, some of that is not, that's not really necessarily STEM. It's more like in the hospitality area. So like I get, yeah, so it's just kind of it's a definition that you have to make that kind of delineation somewhere. And we did the best that we could to align what we thought, what we think relates to more traditional academic STEM concepts and coursework.
Okay, if you have time, we have one other question about whether you have considered adopting qualitative methodologies as a follow-up to the work that you did.
Yeah, I mean would be a huge piece. So Dr. Fletcher in WDE here at Ohio State does a lot of qualitative work looking at, he does a lot of interviews with students who participate in NAF academies, which is, you know, a certain CTE delivery system. And so yes, adding that qualitative aspect is a really important aspect to really understanding what the mechanisms are for different types of students and for all students in general, as far as why CTE helps promote these benefits long term. We can, yeah, like obviously what we've been doing, we can look and say this is what's happening, but we don't have the, you know, the full insight as to why. And so yes, we've definitely considered that, and we haven't gone that direction yet.
One qualitative piece of the puzzle I know that Michael and I are kind of working on is that we're working with 2 other graduate students from UC Irvine and Stanford, and they're both qualitative researchers. And although it doesn't pertain to students with learning disabilities, you didn't see our full regression outputs, but females are consistently and historically far less likely to enroll, even more so in engineering, but also in computer science courses. So we are currently in the midst of a mixed methods piece where they are interviewing high school and college females about their experiences in engineering CTE and whether those courses influenced their further participation in college.
I have one quick question. Hi, everyone. It's good to see people I haven't seen in a long time. I'm curious. I thought this during Michael's, but it also applies to everyone's. Have you thought about, so that coefficient that you presented, Michael, between comparing students with disabilities and not in terms of their course taking, I'm assuming that has to vary across schools, right? And it's not like we have the same odds at every school. And so I'm wondering what school factors might lead more students with learning disabilities to enroll in these STEM CT courses. And if you've started to think about kind of understanding the heterogeneity that's probably out there.
That is a good question. And it's something that we talk about in the discussion of the paper. And I think actually this ties into the last question.
about doing qualitative research, because something actually that Jen, who's on the paper, has brought up is, are students with learning disabilities being counseled out of taking these STEM courses? And that's something we're not going to be able to get from any of these data sets. Is what's the experience like? Or is there something about having the label of learning disabled? And does that influence? And that is something that Jen and I are hopefully going to do next, is what happens when you get the learning disability label through an IEP? Does that change your course taking? So that, I feel like there is definitely room for qualitative here in thinking about counseling and the students' perspectives. I think Jay starts to get at that. I think as best as we can do quantitatively, looking at like utility and self-efficacy, but I think it comes down to a lot of that. If it doesn't come down to course offerings, which could definitely vary by schools,
Yeah.
I think it comes down to, how am I perceiving the schooling experience? Am I being counseled out? Do I see that like I don't belong in these kinds of courses or whatnot? So I think that there's a lot of that going on.
I also, like, just to add on what Michael was saying, like the fact that there is such overrepresentation of students with learning disabilities in your more traditional CTE courses and not the STEM CTE, that's what like brings the big question mark in the back of my brain, where I'm like, when they have extra time in their schedule after getting done with their required courses and they get to choose some of these fun electives or fun CTE courses, are there school guidance counselors, are there parents, are there friends saying, no, that's going to be too hard for you, you have a learning disability, you should go and take a hospitality course, or you should take a culinary course instead? So I don't have the perfect answer of how we're going to figure that out, but I'm super interested in trying to figure it out.
No, I was trying to think through like what proxies would be and the types of data you're using. And yeah, the offerings or the proportion of kids that are taking them more generally, like, but I agree, it's probably these much more personalized experiences that kids are having that are shaping what's going on.
Well, this has been very interesting. Thank you all for taking your time to talk with us, and we look forward to seeing more of your work as you continue.
Thank you. And again, thank you for having us.